62 years ago, in Montgomery, Alabama, a 9-year-old boy vanished in broad daylight, without a trace, leaving his family in panic, and a case that quickly became an unsolved obsession. Authorities launched a wide-ranging investigation, canvassing witnesses and the scene, but when no body was found, and leads steadily dried up, the file gradually stalled and was pushed into cold case status. For decades afterward, the case existed in the silence of the system. As time eroded witnesses, evidence faded, and no further active investigative efforts were made. Then one day, from biological data and technology that did not exist in 1963, an unexpected connection emerged, forcing the entire file to be re-examined in a completely new way. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're interested in cold cases that seem buried by time, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In 1963, Montgomery, Alabama was a southern city that appeared calm on the surface, but still bore the deep social cracks of the post-segregation era, where neighborhoods knew each other so well that adults believed children could roam freely within a few blocks without danger, where mornings began with the sound of buses, church bells, and daily routines so repetitive they created an almost absolute sense of security. The Cole family lived in a small house in the Cloverdale neighborhood, not wealthy but stable, with the father working full-time, the mother managing the home, and life revolving around school, church, and simple family dinners, where days passed almost identically. Jackson Cole, 9 years old, was the second child in the family. Slender build, dark hair, usually wearing simple clothes washed over and over. He had a habit of leaving the house in the morning to play around the neighborhood or visit familiar spots that adults still considered safe. He was recognized by neighbors, immediately known by teachers at school, and within the family, Jackson was especially close to the relative who watched him every day, a bond that created the feeling that his every movement was under control. The day Jackson disappeared began like any other, with no warning signs, no conflicts or incidents in the family. The day's activities followed the usual routine, from the moment Jackson left home until he was last seen in the familiar area. Everything happened in a short overlapping time frame, making it very difficult later to pinpoint exact minutes. In that flow appeared the first unusual detail, not clear enough to be seen as dangerous, perhaps a strange presence, an unfamiliar situation, or a moment that made an adult briefly hesitate, but then dismiss because there was no specific reason to intervene. That very human hesitation opened a gap that no one recognized at the time. When Jackson slipped out of his family's sight, no one thought it would be the last time. There was no cry for help, no sign of panic, just an absence that lasted longer than usual, enough to cause unease but not yet enough to spark fear. Only as time passed, and Jackson did not return, did the family begin to sense something wrong. Questions were asked in confusion. Family members fanned out to search around the house, calling his name down the streets, asking neighbors, checking the places he usually went. All actions spontaneous, undirected, based more on memory and hope than facts. The initial information the family gathered was vague. Each person remembered a different detail. No one was certain what they had seen, or when, and that very uncertainty made the picture of Jackson's final hours fragmented from the start. As the afternoon turned to evening, anxiety turned to panic. The family realized this absence was no longer within the bounds of a normal day. Initial assumptions began to collapse, and for the first time, the clear thought emerged that Jackson might not return on his own. The decision to call the police was made in a state of emergency and helplessness, marking the moment they officially acknowledged that something serious had happened, that the 9-year-old boy had vanished from the familiar life of his family and neighborhood in a single seemingly ordinary day. And from that moment, the peace that had enveloped Montgomery that morning was forever shattered. Immediately after, the Cole family, in their state of panic and helplessness, decided to report the disappearance. The emergency call was received at the Montgomery Police Department late that same afternoon. Where the case was initially recorded as a routine missing child, a type of file that in 1963 was still handled with caution, but without the high urgency of standards decades later. The officers on duty took basic information from the family, including Jackson Cole's name, age, physical description, the last time he was seen, and the suspected area, then forwarded the file to the investigative unit, following the department's familiar administrative process. In that era, a child being away from home for several hours was often viewed as possibly wandering off to play or staying at a friend's house, especially in close-knit neighborhoods like Cloverdale. So the case was quickly classified under 1963 missing person standards as monitoring, rather than immediately treated as a life-threatening situation. This classification directly affected the speed and scale of the initial response, as resources were not fully mobilized and sealing off the scene was not prioritized as urgent. After the file was officially created as a missing child case, an investigator was assigned, primarily to gather initial information and maintain contact with the family, rather than launch an immediate wide-scale investigation. Jackson's file was documented on paper, including physical description, clothing worn that day, daily habits, and places he frequented, all based on the family's accounts, while they were under stress and not yet systematized. In the first hours, the investigator focused on defining the initial search area, limited to the neighborhood where the family lived and nearby familiar areas, assuming that if Jackson had simply gotten lost or was somewhere close, he would soon be found. This decision reflected the common investigative mindset of the time, narrowing the scope to avoid disrupting the community, and based on the belief that child disappearances rarely involved organized crime or stranger abductions. In assessing urgency, police considered factors like no signs of struggle, no threats or ransom demands, and no direct witnesses to clearly unusual behavior, factors that kept the case from being elevated to high alert for the time being. The Cole family, though trying to emphasize that Jackson's absence was unusual and longer than ever, were reassured that he would likely return on his own by nightfall, and advised to keep waiting while police conducted basic verifications. It was during this waiting period that the family's unease grew with every passing minute, weakening the assumption that Jackson was just out playing too long, while from the authorities' side, the investigation clock seemed to tick slowly, at the familiar administrative pace. Assessing urgency by outdated standards inadvertently created a critical delay, as the first decisions were made with incomplete information, and heavily influenced by past experience with similar cases. As night fell over Montgomery and Jackson still did not appear, the missing person file had been created, but without significant changes in strategy or investigative scale, leaving the Cole family in a state of fragile hope, mixed with growing fear, while the official investigation was only in its startup phase, laying the foundation for the entire process ahead with initial decisions that seemed reasonable but would carry long-term consequences. After Jackson Cole's missing person file was officially created and an investigator assigned, the next step for the Montgomery Police Department was to focus on gathering detailed statements from the family to reconstruct the final hours before the boy vanished, a process that relied almost entirely on human memory under stress and sleep deprivation. Jackson's parents were asked to recount the entire day's events, from when he woke up, ate breakfast, left the house, the last words spoken to him, to the moment they realized his prolonged absence, with questions asked in administrative sequence to establish the most precise timeline possible. However, the very familiar eddy of daily routines made it hard to distinguish that day from others, as many details blurred together and could only be estimated, rather than pinpointed exactly. Alongside working with the family, police began collecting statements from potential witnesses in the neighborhood, including neighbors, Jackson's peers, and anyone who had seen him that day, aiming to identify the last reliable confirmed sighting. The initial statements quickly revealed inconsistencies. Each person recalled a different time, some believing they saw Jackson early in the afternoon, others later, and no one could be certain of the exact moment. Descriptions of his direction, clothing, or actions also varied in small details, enough to create multiple possibilities, but not enough to confirm any single theory. From this collection of fragmented statements, the investigator began building a detailed timeline, arranging events in the most logical order, based on the reliability of each source while marking gaps where no witness could confirm Jackson's location. The timeline process revealed a critical window, lasting no more than an hour, during which Jackson was unseen by anyone who knew him, creating the largest blind spot in the entire case, and becoming the focus of all later theories. Once the provisional timeline was formed, police searched the last seen area, the location of the most reliable final sighting, including nearby streets, backyards, vacant lots, and familiar paths used by neighborhood children. The scene examination occurred without clear signs of struggle or disturbance, and uncovered no direct physical evidence of a crime, which both reduced some dangerous scenarios in the initial assessment and left the investigation lacking physical anchors. Officers looked for signs of an accident, skid marks, unusual footprints, or the possibility Jackson had fallen into a hard-to-reach area, but the initial search yielded no evidence supporting that theory within the checked perimeter. Accident evaluation was based on the terrain, Jackson's movement habits, and a 9-year-old's ability to handle himself, and while it could not be entirely ruled out, these factors were not strong enough to explain his prolonged disappearance. The absence of clear accident or violence indicators forced investigators to rely more on deductive logic from the timeline and statements rather than physical evidence, a situation that often led to cautious and sometimes overly conservative initial assumptions. Throughout this process, the Cole family was repeatedly asked to supplement, correct or clarify previously provided details, not out of direct suspicion, but because they were the primary source for most of the timeline, and any discrepancy could shift the entire evaluation direction. For the family, repeating the same story multiple times without clear progress from the investigation only heightened their helplessness, while for police, it was necessary to minimize internal inconsistencies in the file. When the timeline building and scene examination were temporarily completed, the combined results showed no conclusive evidence of a random accident in the area, nor clear signs that Jackson had voluntarily left the familiar zone for an extended time, leaving a logical gap that every theory had to confront. The scene assessment at this stage provided no definitive answers, but it laid the groundwork for viewing the case as an unusual disappearance, rather than a routine incident, as the first, though incomplete, pieces of the timeline showed that Jackson had slipped out of the familiar community's oversight in a short window without leaving clear traces, a reality that forced the investigation to move toward deeper analysis based on elimination and inference. The inability to pinpoint an accident or a clear disappearance point from the timeline reconstruction forced the Montgomery Police Department to shift its focus to a systematic search operation, treating the entire area around where Jackson Cole was last seen as a space that needed thorough sweeping rather than just a backdrop for witness statements. The Cloverdale neighborhood and surrounding areas were divided into smaller zones, each assigned to different search teams to ensure no seemingly unimportant spots were overlooked. From back alleys, vacant lots, low fences, to dense patches of vegetation that children frequently visited, the search was no longer spontaneous, as in the initial phase, but was documented, marked, and reported after each sweep, with the goal of collecting any physical evidence that could clarify Jackson's final movements. During this process, several personal belongings were discovered in locations near the last seen area, familiar enough for the family to recognize as Jackson's but not in places that could be reasonably explained by his daily activities. These items were collected, with their exact locations and conditions upon discovery recorded, becoming rare physical clues in a case that lacked clear traces. The discovery of personal belongings held significant investigative value, not because they directly pointed to a perpetrator or method of crime, but because they confirmed that Jackson's disappearance was not a simple misunderstanding or a short-term wandering that could resolve itself. However, the items were not concentrated in a single spot, did not indicate a continuous direction of movement, and showed no signs of damage from forceful impact, making inferences based on them complicated. Evaluating the investigative value of these personal belongings required police to consider multiple possibilities in parallel, from Jackson dropping them while moving, to the chance that they were placed there or removed from him in a context that left no signs of violence. The items bore no blood, no signs of struggle, and were not tied to a specific scene, which weakened the hypothesis of a spontaneous attack occurring right in the residential area, while raising questions about how Jackson could have left the area without drawing attention. The absence of any signs of struggle at any point within the search perimeter was clearly noted in the records, as it suggested that if a crime had occurred, it was most likely carried out discreetly, without noise, and without leaving easily noticeable signs for those around. From an investigative perspective, this opened up the possibility that Jackson had left with another person in a non-resistant state, a scenario fitting his age, and the social context where children were often taught to obey adults and trust those who appeared familiar or reliable. Compiling the search results and analyzing the collected physical clues did not lead to a definitive conclusion, but it allowed the elimination of some initial hypotheses, particularly the possibility that Jackson was still somewhere near the neighborhood undiscovered, as the search coverage was broad enough and repeated multiple times without yielding new results. The personal belongings, though not pointing to a specific direction, confirmed that Jackson had departed from his normal routine before disappearing, and that the event could not be simply explained as staying out playing too late. From that limited data, the investigators' initial assessment began leaning toward the possibility that Jackson had been intentionally taken away from the area, though there was no direct evidence yet to identify the involved person or the method used. This assessment was not presented as an official conclusion, but recorded as an analytical direction to continue monitoring, as the lack of direct witnesses and clear physical evidence made every assertion inferential. For the Cole family, finding Jackson's personal belongings both reinforced the belief that their son had truly encountered something unusual and heightened fears about the worst possibilities, while for the investigative team, these clues marked the shift from searching for a child who might have wandered off to confronting the likelihood of a crime carried out quietly. The entire results of the systematic search phase were added to the case file as foundational data, not enough to resolve the matter, but sufficient to reshape the perception of the disappearance's nature, placing the Jackson Cole case in a more complex state, where answers did not lie in a clear scene, but in what had left no traces. The scattered physical clues combined with the lack of clear signs of violence or accident forced the investigative team to move to the scenario analysis phase, a systematic inferential step aimed at determining what might have happened to Jackson Cole in the gap left by the timeline. The first scenario considered was an accident, as this is always the possibility that needs to be ruled out earliest in child missing cases, especially in residential areas with open spaces, narrow paths, and poorly supervised zones. Investigators re-examined the entire terrain around the neighborhood, assessing whether Jackson could have fallen, gotten stuck in a hard-to-reach spot, or encountered an unexpected incident preventing his return, but the scene checks, expanded search range, and passing time all did not support this hypothesis. There were no traces indicating Jackson had fallen into a drain, ditch, or dangerous area, nor any later reports of discovering a body or accident signs, making the accident scenario increasingly unconvincing. The second scenario proposed was that Jackson left voluntarily, a possibility that sometimes occurs with older children or in families with serious conflicts, but for a 9-year-old living in a stable family environment, this hypothesis faced many contradictions. Investigators reviewed Jackson's daily habits, family relationships, and self-sufficiency capabilities, while cross-referencing with the absence of luggage, no signs of prior preparation, and no information suggesting he intended to leave the neighborhood for an extended period. The idea of Jackson going somewhere on his own, without leaving traces, not contacting anyone, and not being spotted in nearby areas, also did not align with understandings of a child his age's capabilities and psychology, causing the voluntary departure hypothesis to be gradually seen as lacking basis. As the two most common scenarios were successively weakened, the investigative team was compelled to seriously consider the third scenario, the possibility that Jackson was taken by another person in circumstances without overt violence. The nonviolent abduction scenario posited that Jackson might have left the area with someone he did not perceive as a threat, a situation fitting the social context of 1963, where children were often taught to obey adults and rarely warned about dangers from strangers. The absence of struggle signs, no cries for help, and no direct witnesses seeing clearly unusual behavior, all aligned with this hypothesis, especially when combined with the scattered appearance of personal belongings in positions hard to explain by spontaneous movement. The team analyzed the possibility that Jackson was approached verbally, through persuasion, or by exploiting trust, leading him to leave the area voluntarily in his own perception, but not voluntarily in a legal or ethical sense. This scenario also explained why the surrounding community noted no attention-grabbing event, as everything could have occurred silently and quickly, blending into the neighborhood's normal rhythm. During the analysis, investigators cross-checked each scenario against collected data, gradually eliminating incompatible possibilities based on existing evidence and the absence of contradicting proof. Accident was ruled out due to no corresponding physical signs and sufficiently broad search to minimize oversights. Voluntary departure was ruled out for not fitting Jackson's age, circumstances and behavior, while the nonviolent abduction scenario, though lacking direct evidence, was the only one not conflicting with known facts. Eliminating incompatible possibilities was not recorded as a definitive conclusion, but as a process of narrowing the hypothesis range, helping focus resources on the most logically sound direction in a context of unclear evidence. When investigators agreed that the nonviolent abduction scenario should be treated as the priority investigative direction, this meant the case's focus shifted from searching within a narrow geographic area to identifying individuals who could access Jackson without raising suspicion, as well as situations that might lead to him leaving the neighborhood unhindered. The decision to prioritize this investigative direction did not stem from absolute certainty, but from no other scenario reasonably explaining the chain of events, and it marked an important shift in approaching the case, where inference and elimination became primary tools for continuing the investigation amid limited physical clues. Selecting the nonviolent abduction scenario as the priority analytical direction completely shifted the investigation's focus to the human element. As in cases without clear physical signs, every hypothesis had to be verified through individuals capable of accessing Jackson Cole during the critical time frame without drawing attention. The Montgomery Police Department began by compiling a broad list of persons of interest, including not only strangers seen around the Cloverdale area, but also family acquaintances, neighbors, people frequently passing through the neighborhood, and any individuals mentioned in witness statements, even fleetingly. This list was built on the principle of maximum coverage, accepting inclusion of names with initially very low likelihood of involvement, as in a context lacking direct evidence, early exclusion could lead to missing important possibilities. Subjects were categorized by level of access to Jackson, from those who could encounter him regularly, to those appearing randomly in the area on the day of the incident, to create a clear structure for subsequent checks. For each subject on the list, police conducted background checks using available information sources, including residency records, employment, personal relationships, and any prior convictions retrievable in the paper-based storage systems of that era. Background checks faced many limitations due to scattered data, lack of interagency connectivity, and heavy reliance on local records, making the process time-consuming but still not guaranteeing absolute accuracy. Alongside background screening, Connections between each subject and the Cole family were thoroughly analyzed, including degree of familiarity, meeting circumstances, and potential to be near Jackson on the disappearance day without arousing surrounding suspicion. Seemingly harmless connections, like being a familiar face in the neighborhood, or casual social contacts, were all considered as they could create favorable conditions for approaching children in a community that placed high trust in familiarity. Once the subject list and basic information were completed, investigators cross-referenced each person's statements with the previously constructed timeline to determine where they might have been during Jackson's disappearance window, and whether their accounts aligned with other facts. This cross-referencing not only focused on confirming alibis, but also examined statement consistency across multiple interviews, as small detail changes could reflect innocent confusion or efforts to conceal information. Some subjects provided conflicting statements about time or location, while others could not offer any evidence to confirm their whereabouts during the critical period, creating points of suspicion but still insufficient for legal grounds. In a context without direct witnesses or physical evidence, keeping a subject on the suspect list long-term required clear linkage to Jackson, which most cases failed to meet. Investigators were forced to gradually eliminate suspects lacking basis, especially when no direct connection was found, or when their statements, though not entirely clear, aligned with other objective information. This elimination was done cautiously, as any error could damage the investigation's credibility and severely impact the lives of those suspected in a small community. During screening, some investigative leads were pursued based on intuition or public pressure, such as focusing on individuals with unusual behavior or differing lifestyles, but when cross-checked against specific facts, they could not be sustained. Such leads were quickly noted as ineffective and abandoned to avoid further resource waste in an investigation already facing fatigue and lack of progress. Recording failed investigative directions was done in detail in the file, not only to document efforts made, but also to prevent revisiting debunked hypotheses without new information. The potential suspect list thus both narrowed and grew more complex, as each excluded name meant fewer options, while no name had enough evidence to become the primary suspect. Investigators were well aware that nonviolent abduction scenarios often involved individuals without prior records, no history of violence, and leaving no clear traces, making suspect identification based on traditional profiles particularly difficult. In that context, the Jackson Cole case file gradually accumulated a large volume of documentation on examined and excluded subjects, reflecting the prolonged but breakthrough-lacking effort of the investigation. For the Cole family, this process unfolded as a series of brief hopes and repeated disappointments, as each time police worked with a new subject, it sparked the possibility of answers, only to fade quickly upon exclusion. For the investigative team, the inability to identify a clear suspect despite screening many different subjects highlighted the limits of exclusion-based investigative methods in conditions lacking physical evidence and modern tools. When most subjects in the initial investigative scope had been checked without yielding concrete results, the case file reflected a concerning reality, that though the analytical direction had been set, the investigation still lacked a solid enough foothold for a decisive next step, and continuing to expand the suspect list risked dispersing resources more than creating a real breakthrough. The failure to identify a specific suspect after screening and eliminating a large number of potential subjects forced the investigation to return to the option of expanding the search, this time no longer limited to the Cloverdale neighborhood, but extending to the surrounding areas of Montgomery and the routes connecting out of the city, based on the assumption that if Jackson Cole had left the familiar area, it might have happened very early and in a direction that the initial search efforts had not covered. Large-scale search parties were organized with the participation of police, local rescue forces, and volunteers from the community, dividing the areas to be searched into priority zones based on traffic routes, terrain, and the accessibility for a 9-year-old child or an adult accompanying one. Riverside areas, vacant lots, abandoned warehouses, and sparsely populated residential zones were rechecked, not just once but multiple times using different approaches, to minimize the chance of missing small signs that might have been obscured or overlooked in previous searches. In parallel with expanding the geographic scope, the Montgomery Police Department intensified coordination with local media to bring information about Jackson's disappearance to a wider public, in the hope that broader attention might jog the memory of someone who had seen the boy, or provide leads from areas outside the initial investigation scope. Images and descriptions of Jackson were broadcast on radio, published in local newspapers, and posted in public places, turning the case from a family tragedy into an issue followed by the entire community. In the early days of this phase, police received a large volume of tips from the public, mostly calls reporting sightings of a child resembling Jackson somewhere, or speculations based on rumors and uncertain memories. Every tip was recorded and checked to the extent possible, but most were quickly ruled out as unverifiable or unrelated, causing the initial expectations that media exposure would bring a breakthrough to gradually give way to fatigue among both the investigators and the victim's family. As consecutive large-scale searches failed to yield new reliable leads, the investigation began to fall into a repetitive state, where old hypotheses were re-examined, without additional data to alter previous conclusions. Areas previously searched were checked again. Subjects previously eliminated had their files preliminarily reviewed once more, and old statements were re-read in an effort to find an overlooked detail, but the results still yielded nothing new to advance the process. This repetition reflected an unavoidable reality in prolonged missing persons cases, where the lack of physical evidence and direct witnesses caused every investigative direction to quickly reach its limits. In that context, the resources allocated to the case began to be reassessed at the management level, as the Montgomery Police Department had to balance continuing to invest in an investigation without clear progress against the need to handle other emerging cases in the city. The number of personnel assigned to the Jackson Cole case was gradually reduced, search parties became less frequent, and coordination with the media also decreased in frequency, as there was no new information to release. These decisions were not made due to lack of concern, but stemmed from practical resource limitations and the pressure to prioritize cases with higher short-term resolution potential. For the Cole family, the diminishing investigative resources were clearly felt through receiving fewer updates from police, and the fact that searches were no longer occurring as frequently as before, creating a sense that the case was gradually being pushed out of the center of attention. For the investigators, the resource cuts marked a difficult transitional phase, as they had to acknowledge that the search and investigative methods applied had been maximized under current conditions without yielding concrete results. Although the case file was still maintained and not immediately closed, the pace of the investigation had slowed considerably, reflecting the gradual decline in the ability to generate new breakthroughs from available information sources. The expanded search phase ended without any new reliable leads to guide the investigation in a different direction, leaving a clear picture of the efforts that had been made and the limits that had been reached, as every possible path had been traveled at least once without providing an answer to the central question: where had Jackson Cole gone and how? The exhaustion of new leads combined with the gradual narrowing of investigative resources led to an administrative turning point with profound impact on Jackson Cole's disappearance, as the Montgomery Police Department began considering the possibility of ending active investigation and transferring the file to long-term storage. This decision was not made suddenly, but was the result of a prolonged internal review process in which investigators compiled all the efforts that had been made, from scene searches, scenario analysis, suspect screening, to expanding the investigative scope, and concluded that under current conditions, no further direction could bring substantial progress. Continuing to maintain a fully staffed and budgeted active investigation was deemed unfeasible without new information to pursue, while other cases in the city required more urgent prioritization. On that basis, an administrative decision was approved to halt routine investigative activities, marking the shift from active pursuit to passive monitoring. The Jackson Cole case file was reclassified and transferred to inactive status, meaning no more periodic search parties, no more routine suspect checks, and no large-scale resource mobilization, unless a new reliable lead emerged. The paper file was packaged, labeled, and stored in the police department's archives, along with interview transcripts, search maps, lists of eliminated suspects, and scenario assessments documented throughout the investigation. Transferring the file to inactive status did not mean the case was legally erased or forgotten, but in practice, it removed the matter from the daily priorities of law enforcement and left it existing only as a file awaiting new information. One of the significant consequences of this decision was the absence of any established mechanism for periodic review of the Jackson Cole file, reflecting the common reality of that era when missing persons cases without clear criminal evidence were rarely re-examined, unless there was a specific reason. There was no official schedule to reopen the file, no mandatory requirement to re-evaluate old hypotheses over time, and no dedicated unit for prolonged cases, causing this file to gradually sink beneath hundreds of others in the storage system. For the Cole family, this transition was perceived not through a clear notification, but through the increasing silence from the investigating agency, as update calls became rarer, and then stopped altogether, and their questions no longer received specific answers. The family was not provided with a timeline or detailed explanation of the case's new status, only noticing that searches were no longer taking place, and police were no longer proactively contacting them as before. This absence of updates created a feeling of being left behind, as the family's pain and anxiety remained intact while the investigative system had shifted to a slower, less visible rhythm. From the Montgomery Police Department's perspective, the lack of ongoing communication with the family did not stem from indifference, but from the reality that there was no new information to share, and no specific actions underway. A difficult situation where every update would only repeat the same message that the investigation had no progress. This prolonged silence inadvertently became part of the case file, reflecting how prolonged missing persons cases were often pushed into indefinite waiting within the criminal justice system of that period. The transfer of the Jackson Cole file to cold case status, though not officially named as such in the modern way, marked a clear boundary between the active investigation phase and a long period without specific action, where any hope for a breakthrough depended entirely on the random emergence of a new lead from outside. In this state, the case was no longer viewed as an emergency, but as an unresolved question, preserved in the system with full documentation, but lacking momentum to move forward. For the Cole family, the lack of official updates and uncertainty about the file's legal status created a painful information void, as they had to accept that search efforts had stopped while being unable to close off their fears about Jackson's fate. The shift to cold case status was thus not just an administrative decision, but a psychological and practical turning point, where Jackson Cole's disappearance officially entered a long phase of silence, waiting, and uncertainty, preserved on paper, but temporarily removed from the active flow of justice. The prolonged silence of the Jackson Cole file in storage coincided with the fact that, in a different location outside Montgomery, a child began appearing in the administrative system as if he had always existed there, without drawing any attention due to the social context of that era being accustomed to small-scale population movements, and children being taken to live with relatives or informal guardians. This child was first recorded through basic community procedures, from school, healthcare, to surrounding social relationships, and gradually accepted as a natural part of the environment in which he was living. A new identity was formed and recorded in local paperwork, with a name, date of birth, and family information sufficient to avoid suspicion in the context of a loose verification system, especially for cases of home births, informal adoptions, or movements between counties and states. The child's birth records contained minor irregularities, not large enough to trigger any checks, but in retrospect, inconsistencies in origin, place of birth, or legal guardian could be seen, details often overlooked in an era when data was not standardized or interconnected. The initial documents were accepted based on the affirmation of the adult sponsoring him, and from there became the foundation for all subsequent records, from school enrollment to medical care, creating a chain of externally consistent information but hollow at the root. Throughout this process, there was no mechanism linking this new identity to the missing persons file of Jackson Cole, as the two systems existed completely separate, one an inactive file sitting quietly in the Montgomery Police Department's archives, the other scattered administrative notes in a different location, with no intersection to create an alert. The child grew up under the new identity, integrating into the surrounding environment, learning to adapt to the role assigned to him, and having no reason to doubt that the life unfolding was not the obvious one. The lack of connection to the Jackson Cole case stemmed not only from geographic distance, but also from information distance, as there was no national database for missing children, and no mandatory process to cross-check newly appearing children's identities against unresolved cases elsewhere. Local agencies processed the child's records based on what was provided to them, without tools or reason to probe deeper into the true origin, especially when there were no signs of violence, dispute, or legal violation accompanying it. The parallel existence of two entities, a child missing on paper in Montgomery, and a child living normally under a different identity elsewhere, clearly reflected the systemic gaps of that era, where identity verification relied heavily on statements and isolated documents rather than comprehensive cross-referencing. The case went undetected not because of a sophisticated cover-up effort by the system, but because every procedure operated according to the standards of the time, where trust in initial information and lack of data interconnection created conditions for incomplete identities to persist long-term. In the eyes of the community where the child lived, there was nothing unusual to question, as he had arrived young, grown up with those around him, and gradually became a familiar part of local life. For the authorities, his records were just one of thousands of child cases recorded each year, with no standout features to warrant separate in-depth scrutiny. Meanwhile, the Jackson Cole file remained dormant in storage, marked as an unsolved disappearance, but with no ongoing investigative activity, creating an ever-widening time gap between the initial event and the reality forming elsewhere. The lack of overlap between these two data streams allowed the new identity to exist and develop over many years without being questioned, while simultaneously causing Jackson's disappearance to gradually become a painful memory for the family, but faded within the broader administrative system. The fact that a child could appear, be recorded, and grow up under a different identity without detection highlighted the fragility of child protection mechanisms of that era, where the lack of interagency connectivity and reliance on isolated paperwork inadvertently created gaps large enough for a life to be severed from its true origin. Throughout this period, no specific event was strong enough to draw the two entities closer together, no new leads sent back to Montgomery, no information transferred in reverse from the location where the new identity existed, causing the case to continue drifting in silence, covered by the outward normality of another life, gradually taking shape without anyone recognizing the potential connection to a child who had vanished years before. The new identity did not exist merely on paper, but quickly became the foundation for a life that spanned many years, in which the child entered the local education system like any other student, enrolled in school with basic records, sufficient to meet minimal administrative requirements, and without triggering any alerts, in a context where personal information verification was still largely formalistic. The educational process followed a normal trajectory, from the earliest classes to higher grades, where teachers and schools accepted student information based on the provided documents without any obligation or tools to probe deeply into origins, especially when there were no custody disputes or unusual behavioral signs. Academic performance, disciplinary records, and extracurricular activities were documented sporadically over the years, creating a continuous but locally contained chain of data, enough to prove the lawful existence of a student, but not enough to reveal anything about the past prior to the formation of this identity. Parallel to education, the child's medical records were also established and maintained in a similar manner, starting with routine health checkups, vaccinations, and treatments for common illnesses, all based on the newly provided personal information. Local healthcare facilities recorded medical history, height, weight, and basic biological characteristics without mechanisms to cross-reference external data, especially in an era when medical records were primarily paper-based and stored separately at each facility. The absence of prior medical data was not seen as unusual, as many cases involved children relocating or lacking complete records in their early years, making such information gaps accepted as a normal part of the system. Throughout these years, the child experienced multiple changes of residence, each move handled by updating the address in existing records without requiring full re-verification of identity, allowing the new identity to continue uninterrupted. These changes could stem from family circumstances, the guardian's employment, or other socio-economic factors, and each relocation further obscured the ability to trace back to the original origins, as old records were not interconnected or cross-checked with the new location. Over time, this identity accumulated additional layers of administrative data, from education and healthcare to basic social activities, creating a picture of a seemingly complete life, but one lacking a clear beginning. The record gap extending from the moment the new identity appeared onward was not questioned, as the system of that era did not view the absence of original data as an issue needing resolution if current information was consistent and non-contradictory. The lack of interconnection between educational, medical, and administrative agencies meant each entity saw only a fragment of the picture, insufficient to recognize that the information chain was operating on an incomplete foundation. The child growing up in this environment learned to adapt to the assigned role, accepting the origin story as told or implicitly understood, and building personal identity based on surrounding data without access to the absent truth. The passing years reinforced the new identity through habits, memories, and social relationships, making any doubts about its legitimacy increasingly difficult to form, even for the person bearing it. From the system's perspective, each new record added to the file increased the apparent credibility of the identity, creating a self-reinforcing loop in which continuous existence was seen as proof of authenticity. The initial record gap, rather than being filled, was covered by layers of new data, making backward tracing more complex with each passing year. There was no mechanism requiring review of cases with vague starting records, especially without complaints, disputes, or signs of criminality, leading to the new identity continuing to exist as a lawful entity in the eyes of all relevant agencies. The outward stability of life under a different identity contributed to maintaining silence around the true origins, as every aspect from education and healthcare to residence operated smoothly within the existing administrative framework. Meanwhile, the Jackson Cole file remained dormant in the Montgomery Police Department's archives, with no new data added and no event strong enough to trigger cross-referencing between the two separate information streams. Life under a different identity was thus not just a personal story, but also evidence of how a disconnected system could allow large gaps to persist undetected, as the normality of the present obscured the absence of the past. Over many years, this identity became the only reality known in official records, while the true origins remained unresolved, not due to ongoing concealment efforts, but because no intersection between systems existed to raise questions about what had not been recorded from the start. The ability of life under a different identity to operate smoothly for an extended period was a direct consequence of how paperwork and identity verification systems were designed and implemented in the 1960s, a time when most administrative processes in the United States still relied on trust in declarations, individual physical documents, and local authority confirmations. The issuance procedures of that era allowed many cases of home births, informal adoptions, or moves between counties and states to be recorded without cross-checking against a central database, simply because no such system existed. Birth certificates could be issued late, based on guardian or witness affidavits, and once accepted, they became the legal foundation for the entire subsequent chain of documents, from school enrollment and medical care to other civil procedures. In that context, a child appearing with a new identity did not automatically trigger any alert mechanisms, as long as the provided information was not clearly contradictory and met the formal requirements of each receiving agency. The biggest vulnerability in the identity verification system lay in the lack of interconnection between government levels and administrative sectors, where each agency was responsible only for its own portion of records and had no obligation or capability to cross-check with data outside its jurisdiction. Schools enrolled students based on birth certificates or residency confirmations. Healthcare facilities recorded patients based on information provided at the time of treatment, and local agencies handled civil records based on existing documents without tools to assess the integrity of the data chain from the starting point. This fragmentation created an ideal environment for maintaining a false identity, not through ongoing sophisticated planning, but by exploiting the inherent structural gaps in the system. Once the new identity was established and accepted at the grassroots level, it quickly became self-reinforcing, as each new record created was based on the previous one, forming a logically closed chain without needing to revisit the original source. The mechanism for sustaining a false identity thus required no frequent intervention or ongoing document forgery, only minimal consistency in using the name, date of birth, and personal details across procedures. Changes in residence, as occurred in life under the different identity, further weakened detection potential, as each move to a new locality treated the records as an independent case, trusting that information had been verified previously. In this context, there was no mandatory mechanism to trace back birth certificate origins or verify biological links between children and guardians, unless legal disputes or clear criminal signs arose. Long-term non-detection was not the result of superior sophistication, but a natural outcome of a system built on the assumption that most provided information was truthful and exceptions were rare. The system worked effectively in the majority of situations, but that very reliability became a weakness when facing special cases like a missing child, integrated into a different identity, without clear traces. Over the years, the false identity accumulated outward credibility as educational, medical, and residency records were continuously updated without obstacles, making any doubts about authenticity increasingly hard to form. Authorities had no incentive to question a smoothly operating record, as doing so required resources and was not prioritized without violation signs. Meanwhile, Jackson Cole's missing person file remained a separate entity, not integrated into any broad child identity cross-referencing system, as such tools only emerged decades later. This parallelism allowed two realities to coexist without collision: a child missing on paper in Montgomery, and an individual living lawfully under a different identity elsewhere, each sustained by separate administrative processes with no intersection. Stealing or recreating identity in this context required no modern forgery methods, only exploitation of the era's lack of standardization and interagency controls. This explains why a false identity could persist for years, even decades, undetected until modern verification methods began questioning gaps previously accepted as normal. Throughout this period, no single event was strong enough to disrupt the new identity's stability, no investigation was triggered, and no mechanism automatically linked disparate records. The durability of the false identity was thus not anomalous in the historical context, but evidence of how a system designed for the masses could inadvertently overlook rare, but profoundly consequential cases. Long-term non-detection reflected the limits of paper-based and trust-based verification processes, where data absence was not seen as an issue if existing elements remained consistent and non-conflicting. It was in this environment that the different identity continued to exist and develop, protected not by active concealment, but by the administrative structure that allowed it to function as a lawful entity, while the child's true origins remained beyond the reach of contemporary control mechanisms. The sustained existence of a different identity within the administrative system occurred alongside a completely contrasting reality for Jackson Cole's biological family, who never accepted the silence imposed by the case file and continued searching in their own ways, even without active support from investigative agencies. For many years, the family maintained informal efforts, from inquiring within the community and contacting religious organizations, hospitals, and orphanages, to preserving connections with those involved in the initial search, hoping a forgotten detail might suddenly resurface. These activities followed no specific plan, but relied on persistence and the belief that stopping the search meant abandoning Jackson, something the family was never willing to accept. However, over time, the scope of these informal searches gradually narrowed, not due to lack of determination, but because potential information sources dwindled as the community changed, and those who knew Jackson or remembered the disappearance day moved away or lost clear recall. Witnesses who provided statements in the early investigation phase aged, their memories grew hazy, details once deemed important blended with other life events, and some passed away without opportunity to add or clarify information. The fading of witnesses was a quiet but irreversible process, making the already fragmented case puzzle even more disjointed, as no one remained to confidently confirm or deny old hypotheses. Parallel to the fading of human memory, physical evidence collected in the investigation's early days also deteriorated over time, affected by limited storage conditions and primitive preservation technology. Jackson's personal items, once seen as key clues, gradually lost investigative value as physical characteristics degraded, and no advanced analysis methods existed to extract further information. Paper files containing statements, search maps, and investigation reports were archived in the Montgomery Police Department, according to era standards, prioritizing basic information retention over long-term retrieval and reanalysis capability. Long-term storage ensured the file was not destroyed, but also left it in a static state, rarely accessed, and with almost no chance of review absent specific external requests. Over the years, the combination of fewer living witnesses, degrading physical evidence, and dormant archived files created a cycle of silence, where each factor reinforced the case's stagnation. For the Cole family, the passage of time did not diminish pain or unease, but only altered how they faced it, as searching shifted from concrete actions to waiting and fragile hope that unexpected information might one day emerge. Anniversaries, birthdays, and key milestones in Jackson's life became painful reminders of an unfillable void, while the official investigation system provided no signals of renewed interest. From an administrative viewpoint, the Jackson Cole file existed as an unresolved historical document, fully marked but lacking motivation for reactivation, as no regulations required periodic review of long-term missing persons cases, and no suitable technology existed to refresh old data. The absence of re-evaluation mechanisms meant initial investigation errors or limitations were never systematically reconsidered, leaving unanswered questions dormant with the file. Meanwhile, the different identity continued to exist and accumulate traces in various administrative systems, creating a paradox where one life was fully documented in one place, while the disappearance of the same person gradually became a fading memory elsewhere. Time, rather than bringing answers, became a factor blurring boundaries between the known and the forgotten, making backward tracing increasingly difficult. Evidence fading was not just material, but also contextual erosion, as what was deemed unusual in 1963 became hard to assess by later decade standards. Long-term file storage ensured Jackson Cole's story was not erased from the system, but also reflected the reality that over that long period, the case existed more as an unresolved question than an investigation awaiting action. It was in this prolonged quiet that the contrast between modern administrative progress and the immobility of old files became increasingly stark, as every factor potentially leading to a breakthrough was covered by the dust of time, and Jackson Cole's disappearance continued through the decades as an unfinished story, preserved on paper but almost detached from the real flow of justice. The long silence surrounding the Jackson Cole case was truly broken only when the family, after decades of informal searching and witnessing the irreversible fading of witnesses and physical evidence, agreed to participate in an entirely new approach based on DNA testing, an option that had not existed and was not even envisioned in the early years after Jackson's disappearance. This decision did not stem from a specific clue, but from the realization that traditional methods had reached their limits, while advances in genetic science opened up the possibility of connecting data that had previously been completely separate. DNA samples from the surviving members of the Cole family were collected and sent for analysis, not with the expectation of finding an immediate answer, but to create a biological trace that could persist long-term in modern databases. The initial results did not yield a direct match with any records related to missing persons, but they opened a new path when distant genetic connections emerged, individuals sharing enough genetic material to confirm a familial relationship but not close enough to immediately identify the person. The discovery of these distant blood relations marked a crucial turning point, as it indicated that Jackson's DNA still existed somewhere in the system, not vanished along with old paper records, and that the path to an answer might lie in tracing extended family relationships rather than directly searching for a specific individual. From these results, experts began applying genetic genealogy, a method that combines DNA data with genealogical research to reconstruct family trees based on genetic connections, thereby gradually narrowing the search scope. This process required analyzing numerous family records, comparing DNA similarity levels between individuals, and identifying branches of relatives that could lead to an unidentified person or someone living under a different identity. Genetic genealogy does not produce instant results, but operates as a systematic process of elimination, where each confirmed connection helps rule out hundreds of other possibilities, gradually tightening the circle around the person being sought. In the context of the Jackson Cole case, this method was particularly significant because it did not rely on outdated administrative records or faded witness statements, but on biological data that does not change over time. Analysts built complex family tree diagrams, connecting individuals with distant blood ties to the Cole family, identifying intermediate generations and family branches potentially linked to a child who disappeared from Montgomery decades earlier. From there, a list of genetically matching individuals was narrowed down based on age, gender, and likelihood of existence in the timeframe consistent with Jackson's disappearance, turning what seemed like an unsolvable problem into a controllable series of analytical steps. This narrowing was not intended to draw an immediate conclusion, but to create a finite set of cases requiring more thorough examination through additional investigative methods. In the process, the difference between DNA data and administrative records became clear, as some individuals fully met the genetic criteria but did not appear in any records related to missing children, reflecting the very system gaps that had allowed a different identity to persist for years. For the Cole family, seeing their case approached with an entirely new tool brought a feeling of both hope and caution, as each analytical result required time for verification, and there was no guarantee it would lead to a complete answer. However, unlike previous efforts based on memory and speculation, this process provided a clear sense of progress, as each analytical step produced specific verifiable data. On the side of the involved agencies, applying genetic genealogy to a long-dormant missing person case marked a fundamental shift in approach, from waiting for external leads to proactively exploiting data to restructure the case. The DNA results not only helped confirm blood relations, but also raised new questions about Jackson's journey after disappearing, because if his DNA existed in the system, it meant he had lived long enough to leave a biological trace in modern databases. The process of narrowing down matching individuals continued to reduce the list to rare cases that simultaneously met genetic, age, and geographic criteria, creating a convergence point that had not existed before. Although no final conclusion had been reached, the DNA breakthrough completely changed the status of the Jackson-Cole case, shifting it from a static file covered in dust of time to a dynamic entity capable of being reconnected to the present through science. The emergence of distant blood relations not only provided new clues, but also shattered the assumption that the case had reached a permanent dead end, proving that even when physical evidence had faded and paper records had lain dormant for decades, biological data could still create a path back to the origin. In that context, genetic genealogy was not just a technical tool, but became a bridge between past and present, between a child who disappeared in 1963 and modern data capable of bringing that story back to the center of attention, opening a new phase for the Jackson-Cole file that previously seemed incapable of change. The individuals narrowed down through genetic genealogy analysis became the starting point for a decisive phase of cross-agency data comparison, where biological clues were for the first time placed alongside administrative records that had existed separately for decades. The comparison of DNA with Social Security records was conducted cautiously, beginning with identifying individuals on the list who had valid Social Security numbers but showed anomalies in issuance timing, initial registration location, or absence of early life data. Experts reviewed these records to find cases where the Social Security number was issued later than normal, not accompanied by a full chain of documents from birth, or registered in a location that did not match later family information. The comparison did not aim to find a single discrepancy, but focused on identifying recurring abnormal patterns, where administrative data appeared suddenly rather than developing continuously from childhood, as in most other cases. In parallel, the educational records of individuals on the list were examined to identify similarities with Jackson-Cole's living context before the disappearance, from age of enrollment, first school attended, to unexplained gaps in the early years. These records were compared against educational norms for each locality and era to detect cases where enrollment occurred late or lacked foundational information, reflecting the possibility that the identity had been established after an unrecorded period. Experts also noted unusual school changes or inconsistencies in archived documents, as these details could indicate geographic moves tied to maintaining a new identity. Next, employment records were incorporated as an additional data layer, focusing on when the individual entered the workforce, type of job, and accompanying identity verification requirements. Cases where employment records began smoothly, despite lacking prior foundational data, were flagged for closer review, as they suggested the system had accepted the identity without deep verification of origins. Comparing educational and employment records allowed analysts to reconstruct an administrative life timeline where key milestones like enrollment, graduation, and starting work were aligned to identify gaps or notable coincidences. When these data layers were placed alongside DNA analysis results, some matching sequences began to emerge, not as direct evidence, but as intersections in age, timing, and location, sufficient to narrow the list to a very few cases. These matching sequences included an individual of appropriate age to Jackson-Cole, appearing in the administrative system in a different location around the time near the 1963 disappearance, and bearing record signs compatible with an identity established after an unrecorded period. The discovery of matching sequences did not occur in a single moment, but was the result of multiple iterative analysis rounds, where each new data added could strengthen or weaken a hypothesis. Analysts continuously cross-checked results, excluding cases that matched in one aspect but contradicted in others, to ensure the final list was not influenced by random coincidence. In this process, the difference between biological and administrative data became stark, with DNA providing an unchangeable link, while paper records reflected how an identity had been built and maintained over time. Cross-agency comparison was thus not just a technical verification step, but a process of reconstructing a life journey based on scattered administrative traces, placing them in the context of a disappearance spanning decades. As matching sequences became clearer, the search scope narrowed to the point where investigators could focus on a few specific cases rather than a long list of possibilities, creating a convergence between genetic science and traditional investigation. This phase marked the first time the Jackson-Cole file had a specific direction based on combining multiple independent data sources, rather than relying on inference or simple elimination. Although no final conclusion was reached, discovering cross-agency matching sequences completely changed the perception of the case, proving that gaps existing for decades could be filled when previously separate data systems were placed in the same analytical framework. This very intersection opened the possibility of connecting a long-established different identity to the child missing since 1963, bringing the Jackson-Cole file closer to a confirmation point previously thought unattainable. The cross-agency matching sequences had narrowed the search scope to the point of allowing a decisive confirmation step, in which collecting additional DNA samples became mandatory to directly test the hypothesis that the identity under review was in fact biologically linked to the Cole family. The sample collection process was conducted according to modern standards, ensuring voluntariness, legality, and scientific accuracy, while adhering to strict privacy requirements to avoid any possibility of error or infringement. The new DNA sample was collected from the narrowed-down individual and processed independently from the previous Cole family samples to create a separate dataset that could be cross-compared without relying on prior assumptions. Collecting additional samples was not only to increase result reliability, but also to verify the consistency of genetic traces discovered in the prior analysis phase, ensuring that distant blood connections were not the product of data noise or statistical error. After samples were collected, they were sent to independent laboratories for parallel analysis, a critical step to eliminate the possibility of errors due to process or equipment from a single entity. Independent validation was considered the gold standard in decades-long identity confirmation cases, as it provided an additional layer of protection against hasty conclusions that could have serious legal and ethical consequences. The laboratories compared core genetic markers, assessed match levels between samples, and calculated blood relation probabilities using widely accepted statistical models. Results from independent analyses were cross-compared to determine consistency, and only when these results converged on the same conclusion was the confirmation process continued. Throughout this phase, a key focus was excluding the possibility of random coincidence, as in large DNA databases, certain levels of similarity are not impossible. Experts used algorithms and strict probability thresholds to determine whether the observed match level far exceeded what could be explained by coincidence, while comparing results to control cases to ensure reliability. Excluding random coincidence relied not on a single metric, but on a combination of factors, including the number and type of matching genetic markers, their distribution in the general population, and fit with the previously constructed family tree. When analyses showed the probability of random coincidence to be negligibly low, the hypothesis of a direct biological link between the narrowed-down individual and the Cole family became stronger than ever. The DNA results were placed in the context of all collected data, from Social Security, educational and employment records, to identify administrative gaps, to ensure the conclusion was not only biologically correct, but also logically consistent with life history. The convergence between genetic and administrative data created a coherent picture, in which the identity under review was no longer an abstract possibility, but a specific individual with a biological history matching Jackson Cole. When independent validation steps were complete, and all possibilities of random coincidence excluded, experts concluded that the obtained DNA sample showed a direct blood relationship with the Cole family, at a probability level nearly absolute by current scientific standards. This conclusion was not presented as a standalone statement, but supported by the entire analytical chain that had occurred, from genetic genealogy and cross-agency comparison to independent laboratory confirmation, creating a solid foundation for identity verification. Concluding that Jackson Cole was alive and existing under a different identity was not just the result of one DNA test, but the culmination of a multi-step process, each designed to minimize error and eliminate any reasonable alternative explanations. For the case file, this conclusion marked the first time since 1963 that the question of how Jackson Cole disappeared was placed alongside a specific answer about who he had become, shifting the focus from disappearance to confirmation. On legal and scientific grounds, Jackson Cole's identity confirmation no longer relied on memories, testimonies, or speculation but on unchangeable biological data, providing a level of certainty that previous investigative phases had never achieved. This confirmation was significant not only for the Cole family, for the entire case file, as it transformed a cold case persisting for decades into one with a clear conclusion regarding the victim's identity, laying the groundwork for subsequent steps in legal and administrative frameworks. The confirmation of Jackson Cole's identity through DNA evidence required a specially cautious direct approach to the individual who had been living under a different identity, because this was not merely an administrative notification, but a confrontation with a truth that could potentially upend an entire person's perception of their life. The relevant agencies coordinated to develop an approach plan aimed at ensuring accuracy, legality, and minimizing the risk of psychological harm to the greatest extent possible, with careful consideration given to the timing, location, and participants involved. The approach was not sudden or coercive, but was carried out through official channels, with the goal of confirming identity and conveying information in a clear, controlled manner to avoid unnecessary shock. During the identity confirmation process, the previously matched biological data was compared alongside the individual's current personal information, ensuring that the person understood the scientific and legal basis for the conclusion, rather than simply receiving a unilateral declaration from the authorities. The confirmation did not stop at DNA, but also included explaining how administrative data, genealogy, and timelines had converged to reach the final conclusion, providing the individual with a comprehensive view of the verification process. For this individual, the information provided was not just a biological origin fact, but a complete restructuring of the life story that had been built over decades, making the acceptance process one that required close psychological monitoring. Experts in psychological impact assessment were invited to observe initial reactions, identify signs of stress, denial, or emotional disturbance, and provide recommendations for appropriate short-term support. This assessment was not intended to make a clinical diagnosis, but to determine the individual's level of readiness to receive additional information and participate in subsequent steps, as well as to ensure that the notification process did not cause serious harm to mental health. At the same time, the authorities began preparing for necessary legal steps, including updating records, determining the current legal status, and assessing potential legal consequences arising from the identity confirmation. This preparation was conducted in parallel with the notification process to ensure that all subsequent actions had a clear legal basis and did not create new administrative gaps. Issues such as privacy rights, the individual's right to self-determination, and information obligations to related parties were carefully considered, as any error could further complicate an already sensitive situation. Throughout the results notification process, the focus was on maintaining respect for the individual being approached, avoiding reducing them to a mere subject of an investigation file, and acknowledging that the new identity had been tied to the entire life they had known. The identity confirmation was therefore not presented as a complete negation of the past, but as an addition of important information about origins, allowing the individual to decide how they would integrate this truth into their self-perception. Psychological experts continued to monitor reactions in the initial days following the notification, noting changes in emotions and behavior to recommend whether to proceed with next steps immediately or allow more time for adaptation. Simultaneously, the authorities prepared plans for handling internal and external communications to prevent information leaks before all necessary procedures were completed, protecting the privacy of involved parties and minimizing the risk of unnecessary harm. The results notification was not viewed as the endpoint of the confirmation process, but as a critical transitional phase where scientific data was transformed into human reality, with all its psychological, social, and legal implications. In that context, every action was carefully weighed to ensure that the truth was conveyed responsibly, respectfully, and in line with the long-term interests of the individual as well as the Cole family. The preparation of legal steps at this stage was not aimed at imposing a specific outcome, but at creating a safe framework for subsequent decisions, ensuring that when the individual and related parties were ready, all necessary procedures could be carried out transparently and in accordance with the law. The results notification part thus became a bridge between the certainty of science and the complexity of human life, marking the moment when a truth buried for decades was officially brought to light, yet still required handling with the utmost caution and humanity. The confirmation of Jackson Cole's identity turned a once frozen case file into one with clear real-world basis, inevitably requiring the reopening of the investigation to clarify how he was taken from Montgomery in 1963 and to determine the responsibility of those involved. Even though the passage of time had created severe limitations, the investigative team conducted a full review of the old suspect list compiled during the initial phase of the case, cross-referencing each name with newly gathered information from DNA analysis, administrative data, and the context of life under the different identity. Individuals previously excluded, due to lack of evidence at the time, were re-examined in light of the new facts, particularly those with the ability to travel between locations, indirect connections to the Cole family, or who had appeared near the area of Jackson's disappearance, but left no clear traces. The review was not aimed at restarting the entire investigation from scratch, but focused on determining whether any individuals from the old list better fit a nonviolent abduction scenario, when compared to the reality that Jackson had lived under a different identity for a long time. In parallel with reviewing old suspects, the team focused on tracing the person or persons who directly took Jackson away, based on the assumption that changing identity and relocating geographically required a certain level of organization, though not necessarily a sophisticated plan. Administrative records were analyzed to identify individuals who had acted as sponsors, guardians, or legal representatives for the new identity in the early period, as they could be key links in taking Jackson from Montgomery. However, this tracing faced many obstacles as many involved individuals had passed away, were no longer able to provide statements, or their records were incomplete for determining specific roles. When potential individuals were identified, their legal status became the next deciding factor, because although taking a child from a family without legal consent could constitute a serious crime by modern standards, the legal framework of 1963 and statutes of limitations on criminal prosecution posed significant restrictions. Prosecutors and legal advisors were brought in to assess the possibility of prosecution based on the laws applicable at the time of the incident, as well as subsequent legal amendments that might affect handling. The legal status review revealed that many actions, though severely harmful ethically, were difficult to prosecute after decades, due to expired statutes of limitations or lack of retroactive provisions in the law. Beyond limitations issues, the lack of physical evidence continued to be the biggest barrier to identifying perpetrators, as most potential evidence had deteriorated, direct witnesses were gone, and initial documents were not collected to standards that could meet modern criminal proof requirements. Investigators had to face the reality that confirming the victim's identity, while a major breakthrough, did not automatically lead to the ability to identify or prosecute those responsible, especially in a case that occurred in a completely different legal and investigative context. Some hypotheses about Jackson being taken by a lone individual without broader network support were considered as fitting the absence of traces and the limited scale of the initial identity change. However, proving this hypothesis was difficult without confessions, living witnesses, or documents directly linking a specific individual to the act of taking Jackson. During the reopened investigation, the team also had to consider Jackson's privacy and interests, as he had lived nearly his entire life under a different identity and had committed no wrongdoing, making the public disclosure of information about potentially involved individuals tightly controlled. Ongoing internal meetings were held to evaluate whether pursuing a low prosecution potential investigative direction provided real value or merely prolonged a process already traumatic for many involved parties. The results of these evaluations showed that, although some individuals could be identified as having played a role in taking Jackson or maintaining the different identity in the early years, the lack of direct evidence and legal limitations made the likelihood of bringing the case to court very low. This did not mean the actions were considered harmless or justified, but reflected the gap between judicial proof requirements and the reality of a decades-old case. The reopened investigation thus held meaning in clarifying the truth to the highest possible degree, rather than ensuring a criminal conviction, helping to determine the chain of events and the roles of involved individuals within what the law allowed. For the Cole family, this process brought faint hope that the story would be completed while raising concerns that traditional justice might never be achieved, even though the truth had been revealed. For the investigative agency, facing evidence and limitation barriers served as a reminder of the importance of initial investigative decisions and how time can completely alter the ability to pursue accountability. The perpetrator investigation reopening phase concluded with the determination that although Jackson Cole's identity had been clarified, identifying and prosecuting those responsible for the 1963 disappearance remained severely limited by legal and evidentiary factors, leaving the case partially illuminated, but not fully closed in terms of criminal justice. The reopened investigation's inability to lead to criminal prosecution shifted the focus of the next phase to the legal process for reconfirming Jackson Cole's legal personhood and preparing for reunification within the framework of current law. A process no less complex than the investigation, as it had to reconcile biological truth, decades-long administrative reality, and the individual's right to self-determination. The first step was legal personhood confirmation, in which authorities reviewed the entire current legal status of Jackson under the different identity, including identification documents, social security records, and established civil rights, to determine how to recognize the biological identity without creating legal conflicts or invalidating existing rights. This process required coordination among civil agencies, legal advisors, and Jackson's representatives, as reconfirming identity did not mean erasing the old one, but adding a new legal truth to the personal record. Alongside personhood confirmation, related civil records were updated to reflect the biological connection to the Cole family, including noting biological parents, place of birth, and disappearance circumstances, while preserving data formed throughout the life under the different identity, to avoid creating new administrative gaps. This updating was done on a minimal necessary principle, adding only core information to ensure record accuracy, while limiting extensive edits that could cause unintended consequences for existing legal rights. Throughout the record updating process, controlling public information was prioritized, as the case was highly sensitive and likely to attract significant media and public attention. The involved agencies agreed on an information strategy to protect the privacy of Jackson and the Cole family, avoiding unnecessary disclosure of personal details or speculations that could cause harm. This control was not aimed at concealing the truth, but at ensuring information was released at the right time, scope, and context, preventing a legal and humane process from becoming an uncontrolled public pressure event. Once basic legal procedures were completed and the information framework established, reunification was prepared as a more personal step than administrative, though still requiring oversight and support from relevant agencies. The reunification process was not treated as a formal ritual or symbolic public moment, but as a carefully arranged series of contacts, taking into account the psychological states of the parties and the time that had separated them. Psychological experts and family counselors participated in building a contact roadmap, from initial information exchanges to in-person meetings, to minimize the risk of shock or creating unrealistic expectations. For the Cole family, reunification was not just meeting a long-missing relative, but facing a person who had lived nearly an entire life in a different context, with separate memories, habits, and identity, requiring significant emotional and perceptual adjustment. For Jackson, reunification occurred within a framework, allowing active participation at a level suitable to his readiness, without being forced to assume roles or meet expectations beyond his adaptation capacity at the time. Throughout this process, authorities played a supporting and legal assurance role rather than directing emotions, to avoid turning a personal experience into a rigid procedure. Reunification was carried out step by step, allowing the parties time to adjust and rebuild connections as naturally as possible, rather than attempting to recreate a past interrupted too long ago. From a legal perspective, completing the reunification process did not create mandatory obligations regarding residence, care, or civil responsibilities, as Jackson was a fully capable adult, and all subsequent decisions belonged to his self-determination. The updated civil records reflected this reality, noting the biological connection without imposing any coercive changes to the current life. The combination of personhood confirmation, record updating, information control, and reunification implementation formed a legal and social framework, allowing the truth to be recognized without causing unnecessary disruption. This process closed the administrative handling phase of the case, shifting focus from identifying identity and responsibility to supporting involved parties in adapting to a new reality, where reunification was not seen as an endpoint, but as the starting point for a long-term adjustment period in the lives of all those involved. The completion of reunion procedures and legal formalities did not close the journey of Jackson Cole, but instead opened a new phase that was far more complex and prolonged, where the accumulated consequences of time became the central factor governing every interaction, emotion, and choice of those involved. 62 years of separation were not just a number, but a full lifetime that had passed, enough to form independent personal identities, enduring relationships, and irreplaceable memories. For Jackson, life under a different identity had created a stable psychological and social foundation, where personal, professional, and family roles were built on an entirely different origin story. The reunion, therefore, was not a simple return, but an overlapping of two realities, where biological identity and lived identity coexisted within a single person. The long-term impact of time was evident in the fact that no one could return to the starting point, as everyone had been irreversibly shaped by time in ways that could not be undone. The Cole family, who had lived most of their lives in a state of waiting, hope, and gradual acceptance of loss, had to confront the reality that Jackson was no longer the 9-year-old child in their memories, but a fully grown adult with distinct values, beliefs, and experiences. The unbridgeable gap between memory and reality became a constant factor in every interaction, as stories, memories, and important milestones that should have been shared were forever out of reach. The years of growing up, personal failures and successes, everyday losses and joys, could not be recounted as shared experiences, but existed only as fragmented pieces pieced together belatedly. That gap was not just an absence of time, but also a difference in perspectives on life, as each side had learned to survive and adapt in entirely different circumstances. The consequences of the prolonged separation extended to other involved parties, including biological siblings, grandchildren of the Cole family, and those close to Jackson in his life under the other identity, all of whom had to reposition their roles and relationships in the new context. For some, Jackson's appearance as a blood relative brought a sense of completeness and healing, while for others, it created awkwardness and confusion in reconciling previously stable relationships. This difference in responses was inevitable, reflecting how each individual processed information and emotions based on their own life experiences. The impact of the case also affected those who had been close to Jackson under his other identity, as they faced the truth that part of their shared history was built on an incomplete foundation. This did not invalidate the relationships formed, but it forced the parties to reevaluate their meaning in light of the new information. Adjusting to the new life was therefore not a linear or uniform process, but occurred at varying paces, sometimes progressing, sometimes stalling, as the parties tried to find suitable ways to maintain connections without creating pressure beyond their capacity to adapt. Jackson had to confront profound questions about personal identity, about whether and how to integrate biological truth into his life story, without denying what he had lived and become. The Cole family, meanwhile, had to learn to accept that finding Jackson did not restore everything that had been lost, but only opened the opportunity to build a new relationship within the limits of the present. Psychological experts note that post-reunion in cases lasting decades often involves a prolonged adjustment period, where initial joy gradually gives way to more complex realizations about loss, responsibility, and expectations. Psychological support in this phase does not aim to guide the parties toward an ideal outcome, but helps them accept imperfection as an inevitable part of reality, minimizing feelings of guilt, resentment, or pressure to make up for the past. The long-term influence of time also manifested in how the parties viewed justice and the meaning of uncovering the truth, as the reunion, without a clear criminal conviction, left the sense of case closure ambiguous. For some, the truth about identity was enough to bring a certain peace, while for others, the inability to identify and hold specific accountability continued to be a lingering concern. Adjusting to the new life was therefore not just rearranging personal relationships, but also redefining the meaning of justice, family, and identity in a permanently changed context. Rather than aiming for a clearly defined new normal, the involved parties gradually accepted a more flexible reality, where relationships were built on respect for boundaries, patience, and acknowledgement that not every question could be fully answered. The aftermath of reunion, ultimately, could not be measured by the initial moments of reunion, but by the long-term process of adaptation and life restructuring, where time continued to play a key role, not as a force depriving opportunities, but as a factor that needed to be understood and accepted, so the involved parties could move forward with a relative sense of stability in an irreversibly changed story. It was in this fragile state of adaptation, where the involved parties were forced to accept an incomplete reality and learn to live with what had been lost, that the Jackson Cole case continued to reveal shadows that could not be fully illuminated, showing that even though identity had been confirmed and reunion had taken place, the story could not yet be closed in the full sense of a criminal case. One of the biggest remaining issues was the possibility of accomplices in taking Jackson away from Montgomery in 1963, as the subsequent chain of events, from establishing a new identity, maintaining a stable life for decades, to moving between locations without detection, raised reasonable questions about whether this could have been accomplished by a single individual in the social and administrative context of that era. Although there was no concrete evidence to confirm the existence of an organized network, gaps in the original records, and the unusually smooth process of legalizing the new identity, suggested that other individuals, whether actively or inadvertently, might have facilitated Jackson's prolonged disappearance. Identifying the role of such individuals, if any, was now nearly impossible, as many potentially involved had passed away, were no longer able to provide testimony, or lacked records sufficient to establish clear legal connections. Alongside suspicions of accomplices was the persistent question of silent witnesses, those who might have seen or known part of the truth at the time of Jackson's disappearance, but for various reasons, did not provide information to investigators. In the social context of the American South in the early 1960s, trust in familiar adults, fear of legal trouble, or simply underestimating the seriousness of unusual signs, might have led some individuals to remain silent. That silence, though not necessarily malicious, contributed to critical information gaps in the early stages, and over time, as memories faded, or witnesses died, those gaps became permanent. Vague statements recorded in the original files could no longer be verified or expanded, as the social context and people tied to them no longer existed. This also involved re-evaluating errors in the initial investigation, not to assign personal blame, but to understand how assumptions and limitations of that era had long-term effects on the case's trajectory. The slow response in the first hours, the mindset that a child might return on their own, and not prioritizing a nonviolent abduction scenario, lost golden time that could never be recovered. The lack of interjurisdictional data sharing, absence of a national missing children system, and no periodic review process for inactive files allowed the Jackson Cole case to fade into oblivion within the system, even though the family never gave up hope. These errors, viewed in light of the current outcome, showed how decisions that seemed reasonable in a context of limited information and tools could lead to consequences lasting decades. However, even when initial investigative limitations were clearly recognized, current legal constraints remained the biggest barrier to fully resolving the case in terms of criminal justice. Applying the law to an event from 1963 had to strictly adhere to statutes of limitations and non-retroactivity principles, making many prosecutions, though morally justified, legally infeasible. Even if the individual who directly took Jackson could be identified, the lack of intact physical evidence and qualified living witnesses made the chance of bringing the case to trial virtually zero. This gap between uncovered truth and unenforceable justice created an inevitable sense of incompleteness, especially for the Cole family, who had waited not only for answers about Jackson's fate, but also for clear acknowledgement of responsibility for the prolonged loss. For them, knowing Jackson was alive brought profound comfort, but it also highlighted the feeling that a crucial part of the story remained untold. For authorities, the case became a clear illustration of the justice system's limits when facing decades-old cases, where modern technology could confirm identity and biological truth, but could not overcome legal barriers and evidence degradation. The unresolved issues in the Jackson Cole case were therefore not just missing details in a specific file, but broader questions about how society handles late-resolved cold cases, where truth and justice do not always align. They demand recognition of the case, not only as a success of DNA science, but as a lesson in the importance of timely response, effective data preservation, and long-term review mechanisms to prevent similar gaps in the future. In its current state, the Jackson Cole case exists as a story with its core illuminated, but still carrying unanswered questions, ensuring that even though reunion occurred and identity was confirmed, the feeling of incomplete closure persists, as an inseparable part of a journey spanning over 6 decades that no system could fully repair. From the unresolved state, and insurmountable limits of the Jackson Cole case, another layer of meaning gradually emerged more clearly, not in fully closing the personal story, but in the investigative value this file provided for thousands of similar cold cases still existing in the U.S. justice system. The most immediate and obvious focus was the role of DNA in modern investigation, as genetic science had proven its ability to transcend time in ways that testimony, witnesses, and traditional evidence could not. In Jackson Cole's case, DNA not only confirmed identity, but also proactively reactivated a file frozen for decades, showing that even without any classic investigative leads, biological data could create a new starting point. This was especially significant for child disappearances before national databases existed, where records were often fragmented, lacked connectivity, and relied heavily on human memory. The success of genetic genealogy in narrowing down and confirming Jackson set an important precedent. Cold cases should not be deemed uninvestigable, simply because too much time has passed. Alongside DNA's role was the importance of long-term record preservation, a seemingly administrative factor, but one with decisive impact on the ability to reopen cases. Although Jackson Cole's file had been moved to inactive status without periodic review, the fact that original documents were not destroyed and remained preserved enough for later comparison enabled connecting old data to new technology. This showed that preservation's value lies not in frequent use, but in its existence as a historical anchor, ready to be reactivated when technological and legal contexts change. For investigative agencies, the Jackson case became proof of the importance of maintaining complete, structured, and accessible records, even without resources for active investigation. Proper preservation serves not just the specific case, but lays the foundation for future methods, where old data can be reanalyzed through entirely new lenses. As a result, reopening similar cases is no longer a vague hope but a practical strategy based on what the Jackson case demonstrated. Cold cases once considered unsolvable due to lack of witnesses or evidence can now be reassessed based on the potential existence of indirect biological data through relatives, genealogies, and voluntary DNA databases. This opens a new approach where reopening files does not necessarily wait for a confession or random lead, but can be proactively initiated when scientific and legal conditions align. The Jackson Cole case was therefore not just an isolated instance, but an example of how law enforcement agencies can restructure investigative priorities, giving renewed attention to old files thought to be dead ends. This impact extends beyond the system level to powerfully affect other victims' families, who have lived in similar waiting states as the Coles for years or decades. Witnessing a disappearance spanning over 60 years being resolved gives them not just hope but a realistic frame of reference for what can and cannot be achieved. It shows that truth can still be found, even when criminal justice is no longer feasible, and that confirming fate, identity, or survival of a missing loved one can bring profound emotional value independent of prosecution outcomes. At the same time, the case helps calibrate other families' expectations by clarifying that reopening cold cases with modern technology does not mean a fully complete outcome, but often a complex, prolonged process requiring psychological preparation. From a societal perspective, the Jackson Cole case's value lies in forcing the investigative system to confront its own limits and assumptions, from initial assessments of disappearances to resource allocation and maintaining contact with victims' families. It raises questions about how many other cases might have missed opportunities due to similar assumptions, and how lessons from the past can be integrated into current practices. In that context, DNA's role is not just technical but a catalyst for mindset change, promoting viewing cold cases as living files capable of reactivation when conditions allow. The meaning of long-term preservation also expands from technical to ethical, as data conservation is seen as the system's commitment to victims and families, that their stories will not be erased simply because time has passed. For other families following the Jackson Cole case, the greatest impact may not lie in the technical details of genetic genealogy, but in the message that persistence, even over decades, can meet a moment when science and the system are ready to listen again. However, the case also emphasizes that hope must be accompanied by realistic understanding of legal and investigative limits, to avoid turning legitimate expectations into prolonged psychological burdens. Overall, the investigative value of the Jackson Cole case for other cold cases does not lie in providing a directly replicable template, but in proving that the combination of sustainable preservation, modern technology, and willingness to re-evaluate the past can create breakthroughs once thought impossible. It turns a personal story full of loss into a key reference point for the future of cold case investigation, where truth, though late, still has the potential to be found, and where every old file carries the potential to remind us that time does not have to be the end of justice and memory. From the investigative values the Jackson Cole case left for other cold cases, the file gradually reached its closure phase within legal and administrative frameworks, not as a fully closed story, but as one clarified to the highest degree possible within the limits of time, evidence, and current law. The final legal status of the case was determined based on conclusions reached in prior phases, where Jackson Cole's identity was definitively confirmed through DNA and interdisciplinary data, but there was insufficient legal basis to pursue criminal responsibility for anyone involved in the 1963 disappearance. Authorities agreed that the case was no longer in active criminal investigation status, as all viable prosecution avenues had been examined and deemed infeasible due to statutes of limitations, lack of direct evidence, and absence of qualified living witnesses. Administratively, the file was fully updated to reflect conclusions on identity, disappearance circumstances, and verification results, ensuring all critical data was accurately and consistently recorded in the system. The level of investigative completion was assessed as reaching the maximum possible, as the central question of Jackson Cole's fate had been answered, but subsidiary questions about motive, method, and specific responsibility could not be fully resolved. This led to the case being classified as partially resolved, a status not uncommon in decades-old cold cases, where biological truth and identity can be clarified, but traditional criminal justice cannot be enforced. Recognizing this level of resolution reflected a realistic and transparent approach, avoiding declaring full closure as a complete victory when unfillable gaps remained. For the Cole family, this legal status provided closure to a certain degree, as the pain of uncertainty was replaced by truth, even though that truth did not come with a conviction or clear punishment. For Jackson, closing the investigative file allowed him to step out of the central role in a prolonged criminal case and return to private life without ongoing investigative procedures. In deciding to close the file, authorities emphasized that ending active investigation did not mean denying what happened, but acknowledging that the system had reached the limit of lawful intervention. The Jackson Cole file was thus archived as a case clarified on identity, but historically open, ready for reconsideration if new legally valuable information emerged in the future, though that possibility was deemed very low. Closing in an open state allowed maintaining legal and ethical space where truth was recorded, but not framed as a complete and immutable story. This status reflected a balance between the need for closure to protect involved parties from prolonged trauma, and the need to retain the slim possibility of accepting new information in the future. System-wide, the Jackson Cole case became a reference file, not just for its final outcome but for the entire journey from a forgotten disappearance to a cold case reactivated by modern technology. Closing the file did not erase lessons from initial errors, evidence degradation, and legal limits, but instead served as a summary showing how time, science, and people interact in the search for truth. For investigative agencies, the file closed with acknowledgement that not every case can reach a perfect outcome and that sometimes confirming identity and fate is already a significant achievement, even without enforceable criminal justice. For the broader community, partially resolving and closing the case in an open state sent a clear message that the system should not promise results beyond its capabilities, but also should not abandon efforts to seek truth simply because too much time has passed. In this final state, the Jackson Cole file exists as evidence of the complexity of long-term cases, where the line between resolved and unresolved is not always clear. It shows that closing a file does not necessarily mean shutting all questions but fully recording what is known, what cannot be known, and the insurmountable limits. The file's closure was therefore not definitive in the traditional sense but summative, placing the story in its proper historical and legal context, allowing involved parties to continue their lives with a certain degree of clarity and stability. As the Jackson Cole file was officially archived in this final state, it was no longer an open case awaiting resolution, but also did not vanish from the system's, families', or society's memory. Instead, it became a story told almost completely, with chapters clearly written and gaps honestly acknowledged. Closing the file in an open state was therefore not an end but a necessary pause, where truth was found to the maximum extent, justice recognized within its limits, and the memory of a child missing in 1963 was restored to its rightful place in history, not buried in silence but also not forced into an outcome reality did not permit. The Jackson Cole story reveals something very real about America today. Risk does not always come from loud violence, but often from small gaps in the system and in community trust habits. In 1963 Montgomery, the Cole family and neighbors lived with familiar face safety. That very feeling made nonviolent abduction the most dangerous scenario. No struggle, no cries for help, no one noticing the moment Jackson slipped out of oversight. The practical lesson for American families today is to treat golden time as the most valuable asset. If a child disappears from routine, do not let reassurances like he'll probably come back on his own delay response. Establish family rules. Children always have a safe meeting point, a family password to verify strangers, sent by parents, and the principle of never going with an adult without confirmation. The story also underscores the value of data. Jackson's file went inactive, no periodic reviews, evidence degraded, witnesses aged, everything made criminal justice nearly impossible. So in modern life, proactively preserve information for your own family, updated photos, identifying marks, contact lists, and if tragedy strikes, document every detail early. Who saw what, when, where before memories fade. Finally, the DNA and genetic genealogy breakthrough in this case reminds us that technology can bring truth very late. But it only helps when families are ready to provide data, and authorities have proper preservation processes. That's why you should support cold case programs, record upgrades, and community initiatives on missing children, because sometimes a small decision today will be the only bridge, bringing truth back after decades. If you believe every cold case deserves to be remembered, and given a chance to be clarified like Jackson Cole's story, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue following unresolved cases and journeys to uncover truth together. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video, where we'll dive deeper into stories that haven't been fully told yet.